All right, everyone. Up until this point, we looked at classical conditioning discovered by Ivan Pavlov about how we make associations. The whole dog here's a tuning fork associates that with about to be fed, starts drooling. That's classical conditioning. Then we moved on to B.F. Skinner and his looking into operant conditioning, how you can build an association and actually influence and and train voluntary behavior. So, like for example, the like you're in a school, you're in a classroom, you hear the bell ring, you know it's time to leave and go to your next class. You're driving down the road and you come up to a red octagon, you know you're supposed to stop. Um, a police dog trained to sniff out drugs or bombs or rip out the throat of a gunman. You can train that kind of behavior. Now, Bandura, he agreed with what they said, but he didn't think it totally told the whole picture. So, what he does is he comes up with a little experiment. And in his experiment, he takes a child, young, 5, 6, 7 years old, and he has them watch something. He has them watch an adult beat the crap out of a inflatable doll named Bobo. And just like kind of like what these pictures show, you have this adult there's pushing the ball or pushing the doll around, punching it, kicking it, throwing it in the air, doing all sorts of stuff. And then what he does is he takes that child after they watch this. He takes the child, put him in a room with a bunch of toys and the doll, and leaves him alone. And then sits back and watches what happens. And what happens is kind of creepy, but it makes absolute perfect sense. And what happens is kind of like what you see in the pictures. Doesn't matter who it is, boy, girl, whatever. They start doing the same thing to the doll. And sometimes what happens is they actually get creative. These little kids, like what they'll do is, and you can kind of see it in this picture right here. Let me get my pen real quick. There it is. You can see it in this picture right here, and this one as well. So it doesn't matter, boy, girl, whatever. Yeah, they find like other toys and use those as weapons to beat on the doll. Um, and it's like those two, they have like a hammer and they're wailing on it. There's one thing that in the original video, and you can find this on YouTube, the little girl, she actually takes off her shoe and starts wailing on the doll. And the little girl actually gets more creative in how she tortures it. But what happens during, and the whole thing for this experiment and what was ultimately proven was we learn things not necessarily because we make an association, which is there. We learn not totally based on rewards and punishments, but what happens is we also learn through observing. So we see how other people act, we see how other people behave, and then what happens is we end up mimicking those. And from there, we have what's called latent learning, and this is where we learn passively. And because we're learning passively, one thing that kind of ties into this is the idea of cognitive maps, where you actually create a mental map of your surroundings so you can navigate. Now, you don't really sit and think about, well, like, think about your house, where you live. You have a mental map of where your bedroom is in relation to the kitchen. You have a mental map in your head of where your kitchen is in relation to the living room. You have a map in your head of where your job is or where your school is in relation to where your house is. That is a cognitive map. You don't really sit and you think about it every day as to what you have to do to get there, but as you travel that over and over and over, you are slowly and gradually picking up and learning how to get to that destination. And again, it's kind of like a passive way of learning where you're not really building the association, you're not really being trained, but what you're doing is you're kind of just taking in the information and in essence learning about what's going on around you. So that was one thing that Bandura kind of discovered in the process of all this. And then, and this is where mostly tied to the Bobo thing, we also have what's called observational learning, and we model. So we learn by observing and modeling the behavior that we see. So, for example, the clothes we wear, the words we use, the slang we use. If I say, kek, K-E-K, based on whether you have observed a lot of internet meme culture, you're going to understand what kek means. If you guys talk about, really anything, you learn that through observational learning. And again, often, these are just things you just take in bit by bit. And then the next step is we begin to model it. We model the behavior that we see. So you start dressing us that way. You start using the words in that way. And to a certain extent, and we'll kind of come back to this when we talk about language and stuff like that, one of the things that we learn through modeling is actually language. Because when we're really, really little, you probably don't remember this because you were very, very young. When you were real little, before you could learn how to talk, you observed what everybody else was doing. And one thing that everybody else does is talk. We talk. That's just what we do. And when you were real young and you were starting to try to mimic the sounds that everybody else was making, starts off with something minor like mom, dad. Usually a lot of kids, their first word is no. And that's because they observe all these words being used, and then you as a small child begins to try to mimic those. So you're modeling things that you don't really understand. And then over time, and this is what we'll kind of get to a little bit later, but this kind of comes back to kind of the operant conditioning, classical conditioning thing. So when you're trying to learn how to talk, that behavior of talking can and will be reinforced based off of everybody else's reaction. So like, for example, when you're a small little baby and you're going, ma, 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 and your parents are like, say mom, and then you, mom, and then your parents are like, yay, you said it, your first word. But what's happening is that is pretty much classical conditioning coming in to help and reinforce the modeled behavior. So all these kind of ways of learning actually do kind of, they fit together. So you observe things, you try to model things, and then as you're trying to model things, those things can be reinforced or not reinforced. Just depends on how crappy of a parent you are. But but this is something this is just how we learn. So you take the same idea and you apply it to other things. For example, China, they have that sesame credit thing, and the state is going to, in China, the state wants a certain sort of behavior. So on one part, it is you have the conditioning, associations. You're building those sorts of associations. Being a good Chinese citizen and saying what the government says, okay, that is reinforced through extra privileges or extra whatever. And so that's the operant conditioning side of it. But at the same time, what they do is they also parade the model citizen. So the people that have really high scores who get all the perks, those are walked around for everybody else to look at, and they go, oh, they have all these perks. They have all these, extra bennies and stuff like that. So you observe. If you want the good stuff in Chinese society, you model that kind of behavior. So this all all these things fit in with each other. And they all interact with each other and work with each other and all that other good stuff. So, yeah, aside from that, that's actually pretty much it as far as kind of the short version of social learning and stuff like that. Now we'll kind of come back to this again when we talk about things like language and stuff like that. And even when we get to like the elements of thought, when we talk about, what actually makes up the thoughts that are within your head, a lot of that is tied into social and observational learning. And again, kind of goes back to the associations we make and all those other things as well. But yeah, that's something for another day. And that's about all. I'm out.